Well then, good day everyone. We are approaching the end of the first week of this new patch. It's Tuesday. In NA, you are approaching the second reset of the patch. In EU, we will have to wait tomorrow. But since yesterday we went over what were the first changes that we could see in the raid, today is the day to take a look at the changes we have seen in Mythic Plus. We also mentioned yesterday that while raid encounters did have a main focus, which was the change of covenants being allowed for everyone, now Mythic Plus also has a perhaps slightly more deciding change, which is the AoE cap being lifted, which might or might not benefit in a greater way compared to how it can benefit you in a raid encounter, since AoE is pretty much, it's pretty much the thing to go for when you go for Mythic Plus keys. So now we're gonna take a look at the first week of this new patch in Mythic Plus to see which of the specs are being played more, which of the specs are being played less, if there have been any changes compared to 9.1, and there have been some, as well as taking a look at the covenants. Now that classes and specs can choose whatever covenant they want, perhaps we're going to see some changes there as well. For the covenant point, we have already pointed out yesterday for the raid video that this is going to take a little bit more time to see the full picture, because it's not that people magically are going to find themselves renown 80 with all the covenants. It's going to take a few days of grinding, but you're going to have to swallow through that grind, and then eventually you're done. You can just freely respec without having to worry about any of that. But in the first few days of this patch, perhaps not everyone is playing with the covenant they wanted to play, simply because they don't feel confident, or they don't feel like they can play with a covenant at renown 50 or renown 60. They would rather first get it to max renown, at the very least to unlock all of the empowered conduits. So that being said, let's go over how it has been going in Mythic Plus for this first week. Now, as is tradition, we are going to take a look at the popularity first. When we look at Mythic Plus, how many of the players are playing which specs, starting with the entire player base, before going into the higher keys to see how the meta shapes up for the more competitive level. We just look at what everyone is thinking of playing. So using everyone in Mythic Plus as a metric, we can see that the tanks from one patch to the next did not change, particularly. What we can see is that Protection Paladin, as usual, continues to be the more popular of the tanks, this time even more than in the last patch, together with Guardian Druid, to be fair. But the thing to note is that at the same time, both Protection Warrior and Vengeance Demon Hunter have been represented less. Brewmaster and Blood DK haven't really changed too much. And in fact, pretty much we can say that the rich get richer, because Paladin and Druid were already the more popular one if you look at the entirety of the player base, and now in the new patch there are even more players going for Druid and Paladin. So that's the first thing we can see when we look at all of the keys for tanks. The thing to note in keys higher than 20 is that, yes, sure, Guardian Druid is still the to-go tank. What is more important is that in the last few weeks we have seen Protection Paladin rising a little bit more. We pointed out before that Protection Paladin was the overall most popular tank for pretty much all PvE activities, but when it came to the more competitive level, it wasn't as represented. Well, for Mythic Plus keys at the moment, Protection Paladin has kept rising to the point that it has now passed quite comfortably Vengeance Demon Hunter as well. So now they are the second most represented tank in Mythic Plus keys higher than 20 as well. Then we have the healers. We have the healers for all of their keys compared to 9.1. Their only difference, again, unfortunately for the balance and the evenness, is that the rich keep getting richer, because Restoration Shaman is even more popular than it was at the end of 9.1. Most of the other specs and classes have remained more or less where they were before. Holy Paladin and Restoration Druid are still fighting for second place when it comes to popularity for all of the keys, and then at the bottom you have the Priest specs and Mistweaver Monk. The tune is going to change a little bit when we look at the keys higher than 20, but with a twist. The twist is that back to 9.1 we did have Holy Paladin being quite close to Restoration Shaman. In the first week of 9.1.5, Restoration Shaman has broken the 40% representation from 32% of the last patch, which is a quite significant jump compared to before. Now, this can be directly related to what we're going to be looking at soon, which is the Covenant usage. Most of these healers are not really changing Covenants, did not really need to change Covenants to play Mythic Plus, as opposed to Shamans. Shamans were playing Necrolord in the raid, which meant if you were a Shaman raider, you didn't have as much of a power when going in Mythic Plus because you had to go in as a Necrolord, whereas now they can freely respec to Kyrian, which is the to-go Covenant if you want to do Mythic Plus, and the more effective one, which is possibly why we are seeing more Shamans now than we had before, because they have now free access to their best Covenant for Mythic Plus, as opposed, as mentioned, to someone like Holy Paladin who was playing Ventir before and will continue to play Ventir, so for them nothing really changed with this patch. Now on to the melee DPS. So what we have to look for the melee DPS is that compared to the entirety of the population, there is, the first thing to point out, which is the fact that, again, this is getting tiring, but the rich are getting slightly richer. Not as rich as tanks and healers, but Windwalker Monk and Havoc Demon Hunter, which already were the more popular specs before this patch, are now even more popular for the broader player base. And in fact, the least played specs are getting even less played, because you can see that Enhancement, that Feral, that both of the DK specs are even less played now than they were before this patch. Surprising, at the very least, when you look at the entirety of the keys without a restriction, that Outlaw Rogue, together with the other rogue specs, has not changed too drastically. Perhaps it's going to change when we look at the higher keys for melee DPS. Because what happens in keys higher than 20? Well, what happens is that the jump for the more popular specs is even more visible when it comes to Windwalker, because Windwalker is going from 15% representation of Mythic Plus melee DPS specs to 22%. We are basically talking about a 50% increase of Windwalker monks over the course of a patch. Now, monks were thought to be one of the main targets, one of the main beneficiaries of the AoE cap, because they had stuff like Fists of Fury and Spinning Crane Kick being lifted from the AoE cap, so now their already strong AoE would have gotten even better in Mythic Plus, provided you can support it with large enough pools to benefit from it, and it looks like players are doing it. The other change is Sub-Rogue. Subtlety compared to before has grown compared to the other two rogue specs. We pointed out the main standout, left out spec to not receive any significant changes with their AoE cap that Blizzard had in 9.1.5 was Outlaw, who did not get Blade Flurry removed from the target cap, so this might have meant that more rogues are now going over to Subtlety. It is also perhaps because, as we will see with the Covenant changes, that Outlaw and Subtlety were playing different Covenants, so now that you can freely swap Covenants, Outlaw rogues can more freely move over to Subtlety and play the spec in Mythic Plus. Now on to the ranged DPS when it comes to popularity. The first thing is another one of these AoE cap important points, which was Beast Mastery. Beast Mastery getting Beast Cleave lifted from the AoE cap has clearly benefited them, because now they are even more clearly ahead of marksmanship when it comes to the entire population getting into Mythic Plus. Other specs have not changed too much. Both Shadow Priest and Elemental Shaman have lost about a couple percentage compared to the last patch. Warlocks as a whole have been less represented than before. The main change, of course, that you can see here is the great heavy rise of Frost Mage compared to before. Frost Mage was already ahead than the other two specs for Mage, but not as much as we can see now for this new patch. And it might also have to do with something that we will look over when we take a look at the Covenants, the ability that Frost now has to play a different Covenant for Mythic Plus. But what about the higher keys? What about keys higher than 20 when it comes to range DPS? Well, in the higher keys, the situation gets turned upside down a little bit. This has been a thing already for the previous patch, which is the fact that marksmanship, despite being lower in overall representation for all of the players in Mythic Plus, is still higher than Beast Mastery when it comes to the higher keys of Mythic Plus. Same as for the overall player base, even in keys higher than 20, both Elemental, Shaman and Shadow Priest have lost a little bit, whereas Balanced Druid pretty much did not move at all. The main change goes between Warlocks and Mages. Pretty much, the TLDR is that Warlocks lost 3% overall representation in high keys, which is basically 25% of their entire class, because they went from 16% overall Warlocks in keys higher than 20 to 12% overall Warlocks in keys higher than 20. And the beneficiary of this has been Mage, because Mage was sitting at around 27% of range DPS being Mages, and now it's at 30% of the specs being Mage. One of which is the now newest, largest played spec by quite a good margin, which is Frost. Up to this patch, we had Marksmanship Hunter, even Elemental Shaman, Frost Mage and Balanced Druid fighting for top spot. It wasn't too long ago that Frost Mage was just within 1 to 1.5% from Elemental and Marksmanship, and if you look at them now, the difference is quite drastic. Now that we have looked at their current popularity in both sides of Mythic Plus, the more overall level as well as the higher keys, what about their covenants? What about the changes that they could have between activities? Particularly when you're talking about Mythic Plus, most of the focus is going to be going from raiding in one covenant and then in Mythic Plus in a different one. Do we have specs that have benefited from this covenant change to be able to play different covenants for different activities? So, when it comes to tanks, the main change, the main difference that we can see in the first week is the ability for Blood DKs to play Ventier in Mythic Plus and to play Necrolord in raids, as opposed to Prot Paladin to be able to play Kyrian in Mythic Plus and Ventier in raids. This was something that, for example, top Mythic Plus pushers that were playing Paladin already were doing. But that's why this change is so good, because not everyone wanted to just push Mythic Plus. Just like not everyone wanted to just raid and therefore be locked into Ventier. Now that you can swap between covenants, Paladins can just play whichever, just like DKs can play whichever. The other tank specs have not changed too much. Brewmaster, Guardian, Prot Warrior and Vengeance Demon Hunter have been stuck in their respective covenants. 3 of them are still Kyrian and are remaining Kyrian, and then Guardian Druid is still Nightfey. We also do have some changes for healers. One of the not changes is Holy Paladin. As we know, Ventier, Holy Paladin for Mythic Plus is very powerful, so it's unlikely they were going to move around just because they can respec now. Same goes for Discipline, who is remaining Kyrian. Discipline gains a lot from Boon of the Ascended, and in Mythic Plus even from the Mechanicus cooldown reduction on their Covenant ability, so they are still staying Kyrian. We do have some changes, as pointed out for the raid part. Holy Priest continues to have a wide array of choices when choosing their Covenant, so this time is no difference. Mistweaver is also the one trying out more things, because in raid encounters Mistweaver is still primarily Ventier, but when it comes to Mythic Plus they are trying out other Covenants, particularly Necrolord and Kyrian are more of an option now for Mistweaver. Not really many options for Restoration Druid, who is still Nightfey. This is going to be a recurring theme for the 3 Druid specs outside of Balance. They are mostly just going to stick with Nightfey. The other change is the aforementioned Resto Shaman that we pointed out before. Before, Resto Shaman was in a similar situation to Prot Paladin, where you had 2 clear, better covenants for the 2 different activities. In this case, it was Necrolord for raid encounters and Kyrian for Mythic Plus. Now, before this patch, most of the top Mythic Plus pushing shamans were playing Kyrian, because that was the best possible setup they had, but now everyone, including raiders, including players who just stuck with Necrolord, now they can also go Kyrian when there is to go into Mythic Plus. So for tanks and healers, before going into the DPS, out of the 12 available specs, we can see that there are five specs that can reliably and realistically change between covenants depending on the activity. So 5 out of 12, it's about 40% of the specs having different options, which is not that bad. I think that's a decent number of specs that can go for different covenants. Now, what about the DPS? Is this number going to be higher or is it going to be lower? For melee DPS, we do have one thing we noted already when it came to the raid, which is Arms Warrior. Arms is playing more Kyrian in Mythic Plus and more Night Fae in raid encounters. Assassination Rogues were primarily only just Ventier. Now they have been trying more Necrolord. This goes for both raid encounters, but particularly for Mythic Plus as well. Same can be said for Enhancement. Enhancement is now splitting its time between Night Fae in the raid and Ventier in Mythic Plus. The one who isn't splitting time anywhere is Feral, who is once again just stuck in its cozy covenant that is bailing them out of the lack of any significant burst with their Convoke the Spirits. Other attempts at trying out new things have been done by Fury Warrior, who is now trying more Ventier in raid encounters and playing more Night Fae in Mythic Plus as well. Similar note can be said for Havoc Demon Hunters, who had been Night Fae for a long time, but now that they can swap, they have been trying out more Ventier in raid encounters compared to Night Fae. After Havoc, then we have Outlaw. Outlaw, who was much more predominantly a Necrolord spec. Now, with this ability to change around covenants, they have been trying out multiple covenants. They have been trying out Ventier and Kyrian in raid encounters, as well as Ventier and Kyrian again in Mythic Plus. Whenever the predominance of a covenant is below the 60-ish% mark, I think that is sign of a good, healthy set of options that you can have. Obviously, all 4 covenants divided in a 25% even split. It's kind of a utopian world. I'm not asking that much. It's just so the options do not become as dull as specs like Red Paladin or Subrogue, who are still stuck in their original covenants of choice. Kyrian for Red Paladin and Subtlety with Ventier. Same down the line with Unholy and Windwalker, still sticking with Necrolord. So out of the 13 specs of melee, there are 6 that have a pretty decent amount of options when talking about covenants. Again, we are in at around the 40 to 45% mark for melee. So I think that is also a decent situation for them to be in. What about the range DPS? We talked about the problem of the range DPS, which was the wall of Night Fae that the specs were living in. Now, it doesn't change too much, unfortunately, for the range DPS, because Affliction is still going to be stuck in their Night Fae choice, so is Beast Mastery, so is Demonology, as well as Destruction, Fire Mage, are all still primarily sticking with Night Fae. The main changes are going to be with Elemental Shaman, who previously moved en masse to Night Fae, but just because it was better in Mythic Plus, it is still not as good in raid encounters, which is why now they have the option to play more Necrolord in raid encounters. Same goes for Frost Mage, which we just have seen the rise in popularity in Mythic Plus. Frost Mage has been Ventier for a long time. They are still going to be Ventier in raid encounters, but when it comes to Mythic Plus, we can see the clear exodus of Frost Mage back to Night Fae. The only other significant change within the range DPS is Marksmanship. Marksmanship has also been a loyal specker of Night Fae. They have tried a few months ago in and around 9.0.5 to go around Kyrian, and then they changed their mind and they went back to Night Fae. Now that they can swap freely, however, there are going to be an even split of hunters trying out Kyrian together with Night Fae in Mythic Plus for marksmanship, not as much for Beast Mastery, who is still sitting with Night Fae. So there is not going to be as much of a variety of options for range DPS. Out of the 11 range DPS available, we can only see 3 specs with a decent amount of options in their covenants. So our 40 to 45% average that we have kept for tank, sealers and melee DPS drops down to barely 20% for the range DPS. But you know, there is time and room for improvement in these numbers. As I said, it's just been the first week of this patch. Perhaps perhaps some of these numbers are going to be bound to evolve over time, given, for example, more time to more players to get their renown high enough that they feel confident or comfortable in playing that spec in that covenant, in anything more than just world quests or target dummies, for example, as well as the approaching 9.2. It's going to be interesting and perhaps even good, if that could happen, that a round of balance tuning before 9.2, which is usually what happens for big patches. Balance tuning is what should happen before a big patch, that more covenants are going to be given even more room for success within certain specs, particularly the ones that have been stuck within a single covenant for a very long time. So this was the recap for our Mythic Plus situation. We have gotten some specs growing in popularity, perhaps because of the changes to the AoE caps, perhaps because of the changes to the covenants, allowing certain specs to now more freely move to the covenant that was already the strongest one for them in Mythic Plus, except not everyone had the opportunity or not everyone wanted to specifically build their character just for Mythic Plus, perhaps because they were doing raid as well, perhaps because they were doing PvP as well, so they just didn't want to commit that much to Mythic Plus. We can think about Prot Paladins having to go Kyrian just for Mythic Plus, or Arms Warriors going Kyrian just for Mythic Plus, or Frost Mages just going Night Fae just because of Mythic Plus. These things were not happening as much before. Now they can. Now they can with pretty much no downside, besides losing your follower missions that were ongoing if you change Covenant. That's just about the worst possible negative you can get for respecing Covenants. So for the time being, we can stop here. Let me guys know what you think about these Covenant respecking, and if you have been part of one, if you have been playing a Covenant for a long time and that now you have finally been able to try out a different covenant, whether or not it was a covenant that was best for you for raiding and you finally got to try it, or for Mythic Plus and you finally got to try it. How did it feel? Were you satisfied that you can finally play that covenant for that activity, or perhaps just frustrated because it took too long for you to even be able to do that in the first place? Now, with this being said, we can put this to a close. Thank you as usual for watching the video. If you want to continue supporting the channel, you can leave a like on this video as per YouTube orders. That's what you have to do. You can also comment on this video as well as subscribing to this channel, but only if you have recently changed Covenant with one of your characters. See you guys soon, and in the meantime, I didn't think about what to say now. Shit.